Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today on developing and financing low-carbon hydrogen projects. I know this is a topic that has generated a significant number of interests, just given that we had almost 1,000 people sign up for this and the number of hydrogen projects that we have in the shop right now. But wanted to start with a brief advertisement for some of our other programs. I'm Sarah Morgan. I'm a partner in the M&A and Capital Markets group and deeply involved in our energy transition efforts and our energy transition programming. So just wanted to highlight a few things that are coming down the pipe. We have a presentation on traditional energy and what traditional energy companies are doing in the energy transition, and that's May 5th. A little later in May, we have a presentation on offshore winds and sort of current updates on what's happening there. And then if you're an executive near and dear to your heart, we have in July a presentation on executive compensation and energy transition and ESG elements that we are seeing there. And so registration for that will be circulated on the V&E digest that I think most of you get every week. We'd love to see you. We'd love to see you at any of those as well. Okay, and without further ado, we'll turn to the topic that you guys are here for, and I'd love to introduce you to all of my partners, each who are deeply experienced in this area. Alan Alexander, who's a partner in our Energy Transaction and Projects group, has extensive experience negotiating hydrogen supply agreements and developing ammonia projects, including the Gulf Coast Ammonia Project in Texas, and has a couple of projects involving the production of hydrogen from renewable gas. And then Matt Dobbins, who's a partner in our environmental group, has extensive experience working with clients on regulatory and compliance matters, including with clients developing hydrogen transportation and underground storage projects and downstream petrochemical projects. He also has extensive experience advising hydrogen project developers on compliance with low carbon fuel standards, including California. And then Lauren Collins and Sean Moran are partners in our tax group that both have extensive experience in the renewable space, helping clients structure projects and transactions to take advantage of federal tax credits and tax incentives available in the renewable space, including facilitating tax equity investments, wind and solar projects, 45Q credits for CCS projects. They also are very, very knowledgeable on the tax incentives in the Build Back Better Act regarding hydrogen, and are actively helping a lot of our clients plan for the enactment of hydrogen credits. So super excited about this group that we have here today to talk to you guys, and I'm over to them. Thank you.
As Sarah mentioned, my name is Alan Alexander, and I am a partner in the Energy Transactions and Projects group in Houston. For our presentation for today, we're going to start very high level and perhaps somewhat elementary for a lot of y'all in the crowd. We're going to get more specific as we go. We're going to talk about some of the things we're seeing in the market. We're going to talk about hydrogen generally in its applications and usage. Talk about some of the projects we're seeing and working on. Some considerations to keep in mind for financing. We'll then transition into the very important environmental and regulatory issues that that we're helping clients address in hydrogen projects. And finally, we'll get into some of the governmental incentives that are both available and that are proposed. So hydrogen applications and uses. Interesting little factoid there. Could get nearly 25% of the world's energy needs by 2050 if governments support policies that advance hydrogen technologies. And I think that's going to be a big point of emphasis when we talk about some of the tax incentives a little bit later on. The next slide. So what are we talking about? Building block of the universe, essentially. The simplest element in a number of ways, one proton, one electron. Its symbol on the periodic table is H, its atomic number is 1, was discovered in 1776. Basically, at room temperature, a colorless, odorless, yet flammable gas. It's extremely low density, which is something to keep in mind when we'll talk about some of the challenges it creates in handling and usage. But it can be liquefied at minus 253 Celsius. I'm not enough of a chemist to explain what it means when compressed it behaves like a metal, but I think that means it's extremely compact and dense. Importantly, when it is burned, water is produced. As mentioned, it's the building block of the universe. It's the most abundant element in the universe. And interesting, we all know the sun is basically a big hydrogen fusion generator. It consumes 600 million tons hydrogen a second and converts it into helium. When combined with oxygen, it forms water, and most importantly also bonds together the blood and body of all human beings, but it does bond real well with other elements. Point, as we'll talk about, that's one of its interesting characteristics, and what may help it, as it expands into the market and the economy. The next slide, please. So, like I said, we're going to start, relatively high level here. What is it, used for? Traditionally, it was used in petroleum refining, ammonia production, fertilizer manufacturing as a high-grade heat source. But as we discussed, it's very versatile. It can be combusted, compressed, liquefied, used to store energy or produce it. So as a fuel source, one of the things we're beginning to see, it's actually been around for a while, is it's used in fuel cells, basically in a reaction that produces electricity in order to power traditionally vehicles, potentially other apparatuses as well. In power generation, it can be, you can essentially make synthetic natural gas out of it. There are people investigating how to make turbines that run purely on hydrogen. There are people who have also experimented with co-burning or mixing it with natural gas to, basically co-burn with natural gas and therefore reduce a little bit of the carbon footprint in a traditional gas-powered electrical turbine. We've seen a lot in heavy transportation as well, especially we're seeing more and more of that in the U.S., but seeing more of it in Europe traditionally. It is also beginning to see use, or at least there's experimenting with it in steel making and iron smelting, essentially as a replacement for coking coal, which would lower the carbon footprint of producing iron and steel if hydrogen can effectively be used as a replacement for coking coal. As an energy store, it has a lot of potential uses. The traditional path and what a lot of people are talking about is taking power, at least in the green sense, taking power and using that to convert it into hydrogen gas that is then stored either underground or in compressed storage or liquefied, and then used at times when there's intermittency issues with the grid to then produce electricity either by burning the hydrogen or through some other means. So it could essentially be used, if you think about it, you would use surplus renewable electricity coming off the grid to power electrolyzers to produce hydrogen that is then stored underground, and then when the wind or solar resource is not producing as much, you could use that stored hydrogen to essentially produce renewable electricity that had been stored for a while. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk today a lot about different hydrogen colors. Actually, today we're going to focus primarily on 3. There are a lot of different hydrogen colors. Every time I take a look and try to update this slide, I tend to see another one. What we're going to focus on, and at least for the purposes of this presentation, are 3. We'll talk about a few more, but when we talk about gray hydrogen, that is the hydrogen that I think most people who are currently or involved traditionally in the energy or petrochemical or downstream or fertilizer manufacturing space would think of. It is produced by scale and steam methane reformers. It currently accounts for approximately 95% of all hydrogen produced in the United States. It is a very efficient process. It produces a large amount of hydrogen. It also emits significant amounts of carbon dioxide. But because the technology is so developed and produces at such large scale, it also produces at very low cost. And so kind of the base cost, if you talk about hydrogen in terms of dollars per kilogram, which is one way to price it, it generally produces at $1 to $2 per kilogram. And this is using natural gas as a feedstock and a steam methane reformer. The next color we're going to talk pretty frequently about today would be blue hydrogen, which is essentially the same process or a similar process to producing hydrogen in a steam methane reformer, except that the CO2 is captured and sequestered underground. And so, although CO2 is emitted in the process, you capture it, sequester it. Essentially, it is a low carbon or carbon neutral high form of hydrogen, and that is blue hydrogen. Next slide, please. And perhaps the color that represents the greatest amount of promise and about which a lot of people are very excited is green hydrogen, which is essentially hydrogen produced from renewable resource, renewable energy. In a sense, the most common way to do this would be to take an electrolyzer, which is something that takes water and runs a current of electricity through it. That current of electricity would be supplied by a wind farm or a solar farm, something of that nature. So the hydrogen, when it's produced, was not produced with any carbon emitting form of electricity. Electrolyzation and the production of hydrogen from it, perhaps as an off gas, is pretty common. It's known technology, but there are people looking at how electrolyzers could be made more efficient so that there's more hydrogen produced per unit of electricity. There are, however, no green hydrogen projects operating at scale in the United States. There have been a number of pilot projects announced, and a number of people and a number of entities who are looking at putting some megawatts of green hydrogen production into their operations. But at present, there's nothing. While there's a lot of projects on the drawing board, do 500 megawatt, even perhaps gigawatt scale green hydrogen projects, there's none currently in operation. But hopefully, as we'll discuss a little bit later, once the confluence of a number of factors takes place, including perhaps the right tax incentives, we'll begin to see more of these projects take off and could perhaps really get to a commercial scale project soon. The reason there aren't any commercial scale projects yet is essentially a function of the cost. One would be plant utilization rates, and what this is talking about is solar resource can only be generated when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, which influences also some of the power prices associated with generating renewable electricity, what's known as a levelized cost of energy, coupled with what I mentioned a little bit earlier, electrolyzer efficiency, how much electricity goes into an electrolyzation process, and how much corresponding energy is in the form of hydrogen comes out of that process. There's a loss between the amount of electricity that goes in and the amount of potential electricity that comes out in the form of hydrogen. And then, of course, electrolyzer manufacturing cost. So you add all this up, and the price of green hydrogen can range all over the board. It can be anywhere from $3 per kilogram to $8 per kilogram, largely depending on the price of the renewable resource, but these other factors do come into play. Next slide, please. Some of the less mentioned colors of hydrogen, just mentioning these for informative purposes. Turquoise, which is a very interesting process. It involves thermal splitting of methane by methane pyrolysis. It emits carbon, but it emits carbon in a solid form instead of a gas. And there's actually been, I believe the Monolith project received it's been announced, a $1 billion DOE loan to build or expand a plant in Nebraska that essentially utilizes a turquoise hydrogen process. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. Pink hydrogen always struck me as a little bit of a humorous name, but it's hydrogen generated by electrolysis in an electrolyzer using electricity like we talked about, but the source for the electricity is electricity generated from a nuclear fission reactor, nuclear fission power plant. We are aware and are working on one potential project involving this technology as well. And given the existence of nuclear fission-based power plants in the U.S., this does have some potential. Purple and red are also kind of forms of hydrogen, potentially produced, from nuclear power, but in other forms. Purple being heat through a combined chemothermal reaction, electrolysis of water, and then red being catalytic splitting. I am not aware of any projects utilizing these colors, but the potential is certainly there. White hydrogen would be just naturally occurring hydrogen in the environment. Next slide, please. So back to steam methane reforming, and the reason I want to talk about this, even though you might wonder, why is he talking about steam methane reforming in a presentation that's supposed to focus on low carbon hydrogen projects, is because we'll talk about blue, we'll talk about green, but we've seen a couple of interesting developments in the hydrogen market in the United States that involve the production of low carbon hydrogen projects and or try to utilize hydrogen's nature as a very an element that's very easy to combine with others to essentially solve some of the challenges it presents. The first of those is the production of hydrogen using renewable natural gas. And don't want to go to the next slide yet, but I'll talk about renewable natural gas in a moment. But it essentially uses steam methane reforming, which is an existing proven technology, except the hydrogen that is produced, because it's fueled with renewable natural gas, which is itself a low carbon emitting form of low carbon natural gas, hydrogen that comes out typically has a very low CI score for low carbon fuel standard purposes. And so what that means is you can sell it in states that have low carbon fuel standards and take advantages of that incentive. So that comes back to what steam methane reforming is, though. And as we mentioned a little bit earlier, this is how it's traditionally made. You take natural gas, you run it through a high temperature, high pressure process. It cracks up the natural gas, which is mostly methane, carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms. What is then produced once you run it through the cycle is a relatively pure stream of hydrogen, and carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide is off gas. So next slide. So if instead of taking natural gas, that came out of an oil and gas well somewhere, you were to exploit, what we're seeing in the United States right now, which is a bit of a mini boom in the development of renewable natural gas projects, you can, as I mentioned, generate a hydrogen with a very low CI score, which has some benefits. So that begs the question, what's renewable natural gas? So methane is a product also of decomposition of organic matter. And places where there are large amounts of decomposing organic matter tend to be municipal solid waste, landfills, and agricultural operations. Seen a lot in dairy farms, also swine farms and poultry farms. And the landfills are already required to capture their methane. A lot of them are being repurposed to capture that methane and then ship it off and to be used as CNG to fuel trucks, to sell into the vehicle fuel market in California. And we have seen several projects now that will take renewable natural gas, either from livestock or municipal sources, run it through a steam methane reformer and produce the hydrogen. I'm told, the projects we're working on that, that are doing this get a CI score anywhere from 10 to 15, which is pretty low. And as Matt, could mention a little bit later, that has some benefits for low carbon fuel standard purposes. Why I think this is interesting is because, while carbon capture technologies developed and we're seeing interest in carbon capture and sequestration projects in the U.S., it hasn't reached kind of parabolic levels of growth yet. Green, as we pointed out, is not quite competitive on a cost efficiency basis yet. So this could be, hydrogen from renewable natural gas, kind of a low carbon intermediate step to developing a carbon economy in the United States. And where we're seeing these projects tends to be, so far, Southern California, where there is a market for hydrogen as a vehicle fuel. And so it's essentially taking a market that is existing and hoping to grow and providing it with a low carbon hydrogen source. So it's a very interesting, play on existing incentives that could, be one of the bridges into wider scale adoption of blue and green hydrogen. Next slide, please. The other development we're seeing, a lot more interest in this, and this is going to play into what I'm going to talk about in a moment about some financing considerations, is the emergence of ammonia as a power generation tool. And The reason that's significant is because ammonia is a relatively simple molecule consisting of 1 part nitrogen and 3 parts hydrogen. So it's a way to take hydrogen, convert it into something for which, there's already an existing, very well-developed production processes, means of storage, and most importantly, means of transportation via pipeline, rail, truck, and most importantly, globally. There's a fleet of existing, blue water ammonia shipping vessels. To potentially take hydrogen as a way of being, some sort of fuel or compound that can be used on a global level. And so when you think about it, well, those of you who know anything about ammonia would know it's typically used either as a feedstock for the production of fertilizer. That's probably, I think, 80% of the ammonia that's produced is used for. It's a direct application fertilizer. It's also used to make explosives, typically for the mining industry. Use of ammonia as a power generation fuel would be a new market, essentially. And so why is it attractive? Because it can be burned and it can be used for thermal power generation. As mentioned a little further below, there are already some, thermal generators, generators that will, co-burn ammonia. It's announced, and on the internet you can find it, Mitsubishi Power is working on developing a 40 megawatt class of gas turbine system that would burn exclusively on ammonia, hoping to have that commercialized by 2025. And if it works, then you have a fuel source that doesn't emit carbon dioxide when it's burned. It's using technology that enables the direct consumption or the direct combustion of something that we already know how to produce very well. It would support decarbonization systems for small and medium scale power plants and industrial applications. So it's not just utility scale, it could also be used for industrial purposes. There is a challenge that combusting ammonia does produce nitrogen oxide, but there's relatively well-developed technology around essentially using catalysts to remove that as it's emitted. We have seen a lot of interest on the part so far of Japanese and Korean utilities and energy companies in doing ammonia for power generation. And essentially, they're not just interested in any ammonia, they're typically interested in blue ammonia, which would be ammonia produced from blue hydrogen, or green ammonia, hopefully, which would be ammonia produced from green hydrogen. So it would essentially be a very low carbon or zero carbon form of power generation fuel. Next slide, please. So that's a lot of information. It's a good introduction. So how do we bring it together and to begin to talk about how we might begin to see transactions and deals get done? Of course, the regulatory overlay and the tax incentive overlay is going to be very important, for especially a nascent industry like this one. My colleagues will talk about that in a moment. But if we take all of this and then begin to look at it in terms of, well, if you have a project that you wanted to get financed, what are some of the considerations you need to think about right now, at least for hydrogen? So we'll go through those and then we'll pivot into the regulatory and tax considerations. Next slide, please. So as mentioned previously, the economics for green hydrogen aren't good right now. It's $3 to $8 per kilogram, which compares to $1 to $2 for for gray hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is not as much as 3 to 8, and there's 45Q credits that could help bring the cost down potentially and make it a little bit more competitive. But it's there's additional capex involved in building carbon capture and sequestration kit, so that needs to be taken into account. Another consideration is storage. As I mentioned, it's a very light molecule, which requires and has low physical density, which means you've really got to compress it to make storage efficient, and compressing it requires a lot of energy. So, or you either need very large spaces, which you could also do in things like underground salt domes. And another consideration to keep in mind, it's highly reactive. So you need to handle it carefully. Next slide, please. We've talked a little bit about shipping. This is another practical challenge. I mentioned it is why ammonia is a very attractive potential medium for hydrogen. And just touching on this a little bit, there's natural gas pipelines running all over the U.S. We have 3 million miles of natural gas pipelines. There's only 1,600 miles of hydrogen pipelines. And the regulatory framework is different. They tend to not be, open access, if you will. As I mentioned, because it has a very low energy density, it takes a lot more energy to compress it. That results in leakage. So if you're spending a lot of energy to compress it, that causes some of the final, the net energy that comes out of combusting it, turning into electricity, whatever you do, is a little bit less. You can, inject hydrogen into natural gas pipelines and transport it with natural gas. Usually not in amounts much above 10% or 20% of the total gas within the pipeline, because it will begin to cause embrittlement issues with the pipeline. It has to do with the different pressures at which natural gas versus hydrogen are required to be compressed. I don't know this to be true, but I heard an anecdote that a hydrogen developer reached out to one of the large natural gas pipeline companies in the U.S. to talk about co-mixing hydrogen in their natural gas lines, and he was hung up on almost immediately. Didn't even want to entertain the idea. So that being said, though, it could work perhaps at a LDC level or something. The next one, as I mentioned with ammonia, is shipping hydrogen in bulk using methods to convert it into ammonia. As we mentioned, sponsors are rapidly developing, looking at this. There is an existing fleet of refrigerated ammonia vessels. Obviously may need to build some more, but the technology is existing and proven. And finally, were we to attempt to develop a transportation network for pipelines in the United States, the regulatory framework, for better or worse, you don't have to deal with FERC because it's not an oil under the Interstate Commerce Act. And however, much like ammonia pipelines, it's going to be subject to the Surface Transportation Board's jurisdiction, possibly with some level of oversight from PHMSA and the EPA. Next slide, please. So bringing all this together, what does this mean? Really what I want to focus on are the markets, the availability or lack thereof of long-term offtake agreements. And what we're beginning to see is kind of, I talked about the mobility market in Southern California. That's one. I've talked about the emergence of the power market for blue and green ammonia. That's another. There are other existing markets such as, big box stores or entities that have large logistics operations that could use low carbon hydrogen to power their forklift fleets. There are municipalities, who have already put out RFPs to lower the carbon footprint of their, fueled buses and other heavy vehicles. In fact, there's been a lot of projects in that regard in Europe. And we've seen some in the United States as well. There could be applications in airplanes and ships. But what we talked about as the big one that could potentially develop would be, ammonia as a source for low carbon power generation. That would potentially be very big. The other is, where would you look for some of these things? Would potentially be power generation of hydrogen itself. Storage is another big opportunity, as we mentioned, to deal with some of the renewable intermittency issues we've seen. So there are markets developing, and I think every day that more people get into the segment, they're coming up with creative ways to potentially use it. The final thing I've begun to become excited about, and this is more in the past 6 months than anything else, are just some of the players who have gotten involved in the hydrogen space and, kind of the balance sheets and the credibility they bring to it. I'm going to leave someone out, obviously, but, the Macquarie, Nobi, and JV in Europe, that represents two players getting together to come to hydrogen in a big way. Fortescue Future Industries, which is a division of the Fortescue Metals, the big Australian mining company, is rapidly and aggressively pursuing green hydrogen projects globally. The Japanese and Korean utilities and energy companies we've talked about tend to be, very large, oftentimes conglomerate entities. And so, we're beginning to see a transition from, kind of we're still seeing developer projects, but we're also seeing, large scale, financially sound wherewithal, good balance sheets get into the hydrogen space, which I think, is also going to be key, also is going to be important, and is going to create, I think, tremendous market pressure, at least on the supply side, if not eventually on the demand side. So the space is developing rapidly and seeing, a lot of sophisticated, financially sound entrants. So with that, next slide, please. So I'm sorry, I should have clicked to this slide later, but there's relatively high capital costs. We were talking about economies of scale, and how to get into this. I think, like I said, the big players getting in will help with the economies of scale point. Finally, to begin to talk about, how some of these, business and transactional and, financing considerations, will relate to or will be influenced by what are the overarching regulatory concerns and some of the tax issues and tax incentives, that need to be taken into account. I would now like to hand off, the microphone to my colleague, Matt Dobbins.
So one thing that's unique to hydrogen, right? And when we talk about energy transition technologies that I think makes and opportunities that makes hydrogen a bit distinct is that there's not a unified regulatory framework. An example of that would be with respect to carbon capture and sequestration, you have the US EPA's Class 6 well program. Well, there's no real equivalent with respect to hydrogen, not production, not storage, not transportation. That doesn't mean that there aren't requirements on the books already that are going to be applicable to potential hydrogen projects. It also doesn't mean that we should not expect future regulatory trends to be moving in the direction of specific requirements related to hydrogen. But I wanted to kind of set that stage because it's important for a couple reasons, right? And let's use an example of a hydrogen pipeline. So as Alan noted, hydrogen generally not subject or thought to be subject to FERC regulation. That means that there's no real federal jurisdiction over the siting of hydrogen pipelines. But with respect to the construction, operation, and maintenance of those pipelines, existing regulations that already apply to natural gas pipelines are going to be applicable to hydrogen pipelines. And that's going to come under the development of PHMSA. And I apologize, can we get to the next slide or 2 slides over, please? Thank you very much. So PHMSA is our Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. And the best advice I can give you is when you read through the gas regulations under Part 192, don't focus on gas. Substitute hydrogen anywhere you see gas. Now, anywhere you see natural gas, it's going to be a little bit different, and I'll touch on that in a minute. But as you're looking through PHMSA's gas regulation regs, particularly around integrity management, those are going to be applicable to hydrogen pipeline construction and operation, even though you're not going to really see hydrogen anywhere in those regulations. So there are a couple of unique considerations because of the properties of hydrogen that I think are going to start driving PHMSA regulation in this area. And we did see at the end of last year, PHMSA announcing that they are doing, a various number of research initiatives, funding different R&D projects to look at pipeline embrittlement risks related to hydrogen transportation. They're going to look at the risks related to hydrogen storage because they want to make sure that there are not gaps in the existing regulations. So let's talk about, one example. Hydrogen, it's colorless and odorless, right? Well, mercaptan, what we use to actually add odor to natural gas, is heavier than hydrogen. So that's not really an option here. So when you think about meeting odorization requirements, when you think about other aspects of existing pipeline safety rules, it's not going to be totally straightforward over long haul pipelines if we're going to start constructing transportation pipelines and even gathering pipelines. Because I would note that at the end of last year, PHMSA had expanded their regulations talking about gathering pipelines, but I would caution developers of short haul hydrogen pipelines to really take a look and figure out whether or not any of those regulations are going to be directly applicable to their operations, even though it was focused on gas gathering, not necessarily hydrogen. Another kind of key piece to consider here, right, is so hydrogen molecules generally smaller, they're easier to leak when you transport them through a pipeline. So when it comes to leak detection and repair programs, while it's not necessarily the same concerns that you would have because of issues related to releases of methane, there are going to be some unique aspects of hydrogen that means that it doesn't fit perfectly under the existing PHMSA regulatory framework. So this is one area I would just want to highlight as ripe for potential rulemaking in the future. And again, we've already had PHMSA note that they are focused on these issues. Now, one thing I mentioned that you should substitute hydrogen for gas if you are operating or constructing a hydrogen pipeline. That doesn't apply to underground storage sites regulated by PHMSA. And the reason for that is those regulations specifically speak to underground natural gas storage. So there is a, quote, regulatory gap when it comes to underground storage of hydrogen right now in the PHMSA regulations. But again, that October 2021 announcement, I think this is something PHMSA is going to be very focused on, particularly as we start to see projects come online. Now, some of the other requirements that actually do specifically touch on hydrogen already on the books, those are under Part 173 of the PHMSA regulations, generally relate to the shipment of hazardous materials of which hydrogen qualifies. Those are not terribly difficult to navigate. I mean, it's going to be anybody who's in the business of shipping, quote, hazardous materials, as that regulatory term is defined, is going to be able to navigate those. But one thing that I have noticed as we've looked through various different PHMSA developments is over the years, you've seen a number of special permit applications to PHMSA for variances related to the storage of hydrogen in transportation. You know, there are only a certain number of storage containers and tank cars that DOT has identified as being suitable for the transportation of hydrogen. And as you've seen different operators look for alternative pathways, really the only route they can go is that special permit provision from PHMSA because they're so prescriptive. So a special permit under PHMSA really just means you've gotten approval to deviate from the regulations. PHMSA generally is not a permitting authority. So that's why, again, I say there's no pipeline construction permit requirement under PHMSA, but there are operational maintenance construction requirements in general that are going to apply here, even if you don't need a permit. And the special permit's the exception to the rule where if you're going to deviate from what's already on the books, you're going to have to go before the agency and justify that in a proceeding. So when it comes to EPA regulation, right, what's out there? Well, not much directly applicable to hydrogen. You really only have what I would say that's directly applicable are the greenhouse gas reporting requirements for a facility that emits over the 25,000 metric ton per year threshold of CO2 equivalent, right? So we don't see a whole lot from EPA right now. I generally would think that what you're going to see is maybe the potential for new source performance standards being promulgated applicable to various forms of hydrogen production. But really, your environmental requirements, what you'll look to the EPA when it comes to hydrogen projects, what you'll look to state agencies, are going to be your run-of-the-mill traditional air permitting, water quality permitting requirements. You're just going to have to deal with them in the context of building hydrogen production, transportation, or storage assets. So can we get the next slide, please? The last slide and this slide touch on two existing regulatory programs that are directly applicable to hydrogen storage. These are EPA's Risk Management Program under the Clean Air Act and OSHA's Process Safety Management Standard. Essentially, these standards are designed to ensure and reduce that safeguards are in place to reduce the risk of catastrophic incidents. So if you're trying to gauge risks, right? If you're looking at an investment, looking at a project, and you want to gauge risks related to hydrogen, the framework I advise you use is what you would apply in any kind of traditional chemical or energy production context. That doesn't mean there won't be nuances and it won't have to be modified, but in terms of the basic approach, I think that's a sound one, given again that we have all these different requirements out there that touch on hydrogen, even if they're not hydrogen focused. We already mentioned the areas that are probably ripe for future regulation of hydrogen, direct regulation, I would say. But I do want to caution everybody again about this issue of traditional environmental requirements, run of the mill, that could actually pose some roadblocks to hydrogen project development. And the reason I suggest that they could pose roadblocks are, one, environmental justice consideration. Think about where existing hydrogen production capacity is located, right? It's overwhelmingly concentrated in probably what EPA would classify as EJ communities. These are communities that are socioeconomically, economically disadvantaged. They may be minority, majority communities, and they typically are co-located adjacent to or in the middle of highly industrialized areas. And what are the practical effects of that? Well, if you're going to do this big expansion project in an existing facility, create some hydrogen production capacity, I think you will see EPA taking a hard look at some of the EJ impacts, right? We've seen this in other areas already, EPA flexing its muscles in the permitting context. And it's not just major source permitting. Permits that a decade ago, 2 decades ago would have been fairly straightforward to obtain. You're seeing a lot more scrutiny from the federal level and growing scrutiny at the state level in some jurisdictions as well around some of these traditional environmental requirements like water quality certification and, again, obtaining minor source air permits that are really going to have the potential to stymie project development if you don't get out ahead of them in advance. The other aspect that I would say is important when thinking about how traditional environmental requirements, for lack of a better term, apply to hydrogen is the issue of certain environmental organizations view hydrogen, much like they view CCS, as a potential lifeline to the oil and gas industry. And these environmental organizations are going to oppose hydrogen projects, hydrogen storage projects, production projects, transportation projects, likely solely on that basis. So the same opposition you've seen to oil and natural gas pipeline transportation projects, infrastructure projects, oil and natural gas drilling projects, I think there is significant potential that you'll see the same level of attention, scrutiny, and potential fights applied in the hydrogen space as well. Now, I don't want people freaking out. I don't want them worrying, well, how on earth am I going to get these projects off the ground? We see that there are ways to manage these risks. We've got an existing toolbox to help navigate. And in the backdrop of all of this is plenty of signals from the current administration and prior administration crosses party lines for increasing hydrogen production and transportation capacity. So the headwinds, I think, are going in the right direction. I just want to raise the point that, just because we have an energy transition technology, right, an energy transition product, doesn't necessarily mean that you no longer have the traditional environmental risks to navigate and deal with. Next slide, please. So another major focus of hydrogen production is this idea of environmental attributes. And usually that comes up in the context of renewable fuels, right? We've got the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Oregon and Washington have similar standards. I'm going to talk primarily about LCFS in California today, just because it's been around the longest. But I'd be remiss if I didn't point out Oregon's regulations and laws explicitly name hydrogen. Washington proposed last year, and I think it may have been finalized, though I need to check, regulations that also explicitly name hydrogen as a potential fuel that would be eligible for generation of credits under their own clean fuel programs. But when it comes to the LCFS, there are a few kind of unique things to keep in mind about hydrogen, right? You've got one, this idea that simply building the infrastructure will allow you to generate LCFS credits. That's under the zero emission vehicle infrastructure provisions of LCFS. There's also opportunities for project-based crediting at refineries, right? If you integrate use of renewable hydrogen into refinery production to create gasoline, diesel, you are eligible to generate some LCFS credits potentially with those types of projects as well. I wish I could say that those same opportunities existed at the federal level, despite EPA promulgating a rule back in, I think, July of 2014, where there was a specific discussion about how hydrogen production, particularly hydrogen used to make RNG, renewable natural gas, would be eligible for generating RINs under the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard. EPA has been incredibly slow in reviewing and approving fuel pathway applications under the RFS. To my knowledge, there are 5 fuel pathway applications related that involve some component of hydrogen in the production of renewable fuels that have just languished at EPA for years. And separately, it'll be interesting to see. I haven't heard any particular kind of buzz around the hydrogen issue under the RFS, but I'm sure many of you that follow RFS developments know that there's been a lot of focus on EPA getting the let out when it comes to approving generation of eRINs, meaning electric power that is produced through renewable fuels that then is used to potentially fuel electric vehicles. And there's been legislation introduced in Congress to force EPA to do it. The administration has sent memos and been pretty direct that this is something they want EPA to take action on. And so there could conceivably be ways, as we think about how hydrogen might be used in other forms of power generation, right, that we might be able to find a way to fit it in under the RFS. But to date, there really is not a lot of room at all to play in the RIN space. So the focus is overwhelmingly on low carbon fuel standard. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to belabor this too much. I want us to get to the tax credits. I know we're talking about money, so people are probably more focused on the environmental piece right now than they normally are in the context of these credits, but really everybody cares about the tax credit, right? So we'll get there. But here I just want to highlight, the 2 primary ways you're going to see LCFS credits generated with respect to hydrogen. One is, basically used through electrolysis, and you've got 2 options there. You've got the ability to go under existing pathways by looking at the lookup table pathway applications. An application under that framework is a lot easier to process. The only caveat I would say is, everybody says if you want to play in the LCFS, you just have to sell your fuel right in California. It doesn't necessarily have to be produced there. The difference here is if you want to go in under the lookup table pathways, you're actually going to have to produce the electricity via hydrogen in California. You're going to have a few more restrictions. Practically, that might not mean much, right? It could be, that's probably the only types of projects people are looking at. But I just want to, raise it so that everybody's aware of it. You still could find ways to produce it outside of California, but then you're going to have to go through the tier 2 pathway process, which can be a little bit more burdensome, more drawn out, take longer to get CARB to approve that. And then the other one noted on the slide is that vehicle fueling infrastructure, zero emission vehicle fueling infrastructure. There are a couple of quirks to this, right? Typically, it's going to be the entity that owns the infrastructure that generates that credit, holds that credit. The CARB regulations do allow parties to allocate the credit between them, but it could add, additional contract, paperwork exercises, things to consider. We've seen lots of interesting setups where various credits are split. A fractional interest is split between parties across the value chain in production of renewable fuels. And so there are plenty of opportunities to make sure somebody can find a way to monetize these environmental attributes. Next slide, please. And again, I want to talk about, ESG related issues to hydrogen. Any energy transition technology, any energy transition product, energy transition focused fuel is going to have ESG consideration. And what I want to caution companies on, whether you are looking at this for direct projects or whether you're looking to invest potentially, whether you're looking to finance them, is where you are on the rainbow does matter with respect to how a potential hydrogen investment fits in with your overall energy transition strategy and ESG focus. So you need to be very careful not to overhype the benefits of a potential investment if when you really drill down, it's not the right color of hydrogen, or potentially the way that it's transported causes issues with respect to overall carbon intensity, potential leakage concerns. Those are issues that really need to be thought about when you think about how you package this message in terms of your ESG strategy. Hydrogen certainly has a place in various net zero strategies that we've advised multiple clients on. And, we've talked with a number of midstream clients about the potential to convert existing natural gas assets, transport hydrogen. While I'm not a FERC attorney, the one thing I want to caution there is that will bring FERC into play if you're going to, make a change to existing natural gas pipeline entities. And so that's going to trigger all the traditional potential environmental reviews you have to navigate in natural gas pipeline construction, modification, and operation as well. So, there are a lot of different pieces here that have to be thoughtfully navigated. And, in that same vein, everybody's probably tired of hearing it. I know it's the buzzword of the year, greenwashing, right? Greenwashing isn't just about, concern related to the FTC green guides. Admittedly, while we have seen increased focus there, you've yet to see kind of, very robust enforcement of those. And I think that potentially that's one area where we're going to see change, right? The administration is certainly very focused on pulling every lever that they have available to them to address climate change concerns. And greenwashing is a climate change concern. Public companies also, again, when I talk about, being very careful about your messaging and how your particular hydrogen investment fits into your overall energy transition thesis, you're going to have to watch out for not necessarily misleading investors as to the potential carbon benefits a particular hydrogen project may offer. And finally, again, all of that's wrapped up in reputational risks, right? Many actors are concerned about, do we really want to invest in a project that's not going to deliver on the green benefits, the green attributes that we are showing to our investors are a key focus for our future investment. So I will leave it at that, but I will turn it over to my tax colleagues to run with what I'm sure everybody's very, very focused on with respect to hydrogen.
I know we're probably running out of time, and we'll keep going for a few minutes, but for anyone that does need to drop, all of our contact information is on the website. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these topics further. So let's go forward, I think 2 slides. Okay, so just briefly want to touch on this. There was a bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed at the end of last year. It set aside $9.5 billion in federal funding for clean hydrogen development. The biggest of these programs was an $8 billion program for the development of 4 regional hydrogen hubs. These hubs need to be diverse with respect to feedstock, end use, and geography. And the government has until May of next year to actually identify these hubs. They put out a request for information earlier this year, so I'm sure they're hard at work trying to nail down where those might be and how those programs are going to be implemented. Next slide. One other thing just worth noting quickly on the Infrastructure Act is that it directed the government to develop a national hydrogen roadmap and strategy, whatever that means. But the point here is, as Matt mentioned, the headwinds are really supportive of clean hydrogen development, and the government has, actively pursued development of these projects and figuring out how to make it a viable part of our energy landscape. Next slide. Let's skip one more forward. Thank you. Okay, so currently there's no tax credits for hydrogen production or investment. There are tax credits for carbon capture and sequestration, which can be utilized in connection with the Blue Hydrogen project, but nothing specific to hydrogen. As Alan highlighted earlier, green and even blue hydrogen is uneconomic as compared to gray hydrogen. So enacting a federal tax credit to help subsidize the development of clean hydrogen projects would go a long way towards making these projects cost competitive and making clean hydrogen a viable energy source. The Build Back Better Act, if passed, would have included a hydrogen production and investment tax credit. Unfortunately, that legislation is all but dead. There does remain some optimism that we'll see these energy provisions be resurrected in some form. And if you followed any of the drama in DC on Build Back Better, most of the legislation, ran into a lot of issues due to one man, Senator Manchin. but he does not seem totally adverse to some form of energy tax legislation. And importantly, many of the hydrogen programs that were in the infrastructure law I just touched on were championed by Senator Manchin. So with that optimism that we might see a hydrogen tax credit, we just want to touch briefly on what that might look like based off of what was in Build Back Better. Namely, it would have been a 10-year production tax credit or a 1-year or one-time investment tax credit. Taxpayers could elect which of the two they wanted to take. Taxpayers could also elect for direct payment of the credit. This would essentially eliminate any need for tax capacity or a tax equity investor. Next slide. So the credit, if it were enacted, it would have been available on a sliding scale with respect to qualified hydrogen. This is basically hydrogen where less than 6 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent is emitted per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And as the amount of the carbon dioxide emitted decreases, the amount of the credit increases. For green hydrogen projects, those are projects where hydrogen is produced by electrolysis from renewable projects. The taxpayer can take advantage of the renewable credit plus the hydrogen credit. However, if a facility has a hydrogen project and a carbon capture project, you can't take both the hydrogen credit and the carbon capture credit. The credit amount also increases by 5-fold if you satisfy certain prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. Next slide. So here, these last two slides are just to show you, essentially how the credit is structured. You'll see that we've set it up such that on the left side is what happens or what the credit amount is if you don't satisfy the labor requirements, and on the right side, the credit amount if you do, and that it increases based off of the reduction in the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. For production tax credit, it's $3 per kilogram of qualified clean hydrogen produced. Next slide. And for the ITC, it tops out at 30% of the eligible basis of the hydrogen credit. So I think I jammed all of that into, I think we only went over by 2 minutes. Again, don't hesitate to reach out if you would like to discuss any more of this. Before we let folks go, Matt, Alan, anything we wanted to touch on from the questions we were getting?
Lauren, thank you. I think given that we've gone over a little bit, we've got the questions here. We will just work on reverting in the next few days.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining.